The unmistakable click of a revolver's hammer being cocked echoed through the dimly lit pantry, causing Willa Harper to freeze, her thin fingers still clutching the small sack of cornmeal she'd been about to slip into her tattered coat. She didn't turn around immediately, knowing full well what she would find: another angry face, another threat, another reason to run. It was 1876 in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, and mercy was as scarce as rain in the dusty, gold-obsessed settlement. "Madam, I don't recall inviting you to help yourself to my supplies," came a deep, tired voice that held more exhaustion than anger. Willa slowly turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially shadowed by the brim of a worn Stetson. His clothes were dusty, but well-maintained, the mark of someone who took pride in what little he had. Despite the gun pointed in her direction, his blue eyes held something she hadn't seen in a long time: restraint. She began, but her parched throat betrayed her. When was the last time she'd had water? Yesterday morning, perhaps? The man's gaze drifted from her face down to her dirt-smudged hands and the visible trembling of her limbs. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "When's the last time you ate something proper?" The unexpected question caught her off guard. 3 days, she admitted, figuring the truth couldn't worsen her situation. Preston Owens lowered his revolver slightly, studying the woman before him. She was young, mid-20s at most, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a simple bonnet. Despite the dirt and exhaustion marking her features, there was a dignity in her posture, a refusal to cower that struck him. "My son and I were about to have supper," he said after a moment, holstering his weapon. "It ain't much, but there's enough for 3. I reckon stealing's a hard business when you're shaking like a leaf." Willa's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're inviting me to eat with you? After catching me stealing?" "I'm offering you a meal," Preston clarified, his voice gruff but not unkind. "What you do after is your business." "But a person doesn't resort to stealing unless they're desperate, and desperate folks deserve at least one chance to fill their belly honestly." He turned and walked toward the doorway, not looking back to see if she followed. Willa stood frozen for a moment, warring emotions keeping her rooted in place. Pride told her to flee, to refuse charity from the man she'd just attempted to rob. But hunger, the gnawing, persistent kind that had been her constant companion for too long, won out. She carefully placed the cornmeal back on the shelf and followed him through the door. The main room of the small cabin was simple but clean. A fire burned low in the hearth, and a boy of about 10 sat at a rough-hewn table, setting out tin plates and cups. He looked up in surprise when Willa entered behind his father. "Pa, who's she?" the boy asked, curiosity evident in his face that so clearly resembled his father's. "This is Mississippi." Preston paused, raising an eyebrow at Willa. "Harper," she supplied cautiously. "Willa Harper. Miss Harper will be joining us for supper, Caleb," Preston explained, moving to the pot hanging over the fire. "Set another place, would you?" The boy nodded, reaching for another plate without question. Willa stood awkwardly near the door, unsure whether she should offer to help or remain still. "You can wash up there," Preston nodded toward a basin of water in the corner. "Food'll be ready shortly." Willa moved to the basin, grateful for the chance to clean the dirt from her hands and face. The cool water was a blessing she hadn't experienced in days, and she had to resist the urge to drink directly from the basin. The meal was simple rabbit stew with potatoes and carrots, and a few slices of slightly stale bread, but to Willa, it was a feast. She struggled to eat slowly, to maintain some semblance of dignity despite the hunger threatening to overcome her manners. "You're not from around here," Preston observed as they ate. It wasn't a question. Willa swallowed a mouthful of stew. "No, I came from St. Louis. Arrived in Deadwood 2 weeks ago. Alone?" The question came from Caleb, earning him a sharp look from his father. "Yes," Willa answered, seeing no reason to lie. "I had arrangements that didn't work out." Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. Many women came to frontier towns like Deadwood with promises of respectable work or marriage, only to find themselves deceived. Some ended up in brothels, others simply disappeared. "Where are you staying?" Preston asked, breaking off a piece of bread. Willa hesitated. "I had a room at the boarding house, but—" She trailed off, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "But you couldn't pay the rent," Preston finished for her. "So where have you been sleeping?" Where I can, she answered, lifting her chin slightly. I'm not afraid of the outdoors. Preston exchanged a look with his son before turning back to Willa. It'll be getting cold soon. Winter comes early up here. I'm aware of the seasons, Mr. Owens, Willa replied, a touch of defensiveness in her voice. The ghost of a smile touched Preston's lips. I reckon you are. I also reckon you know it's not safe for a woman alone in these parts, especially one without shelter. Willa set down her spoon. Her appetite suddenly diminished despite her hunger. I appreciate the meal, Mr. Owens, truly. But if you're worried I'll try to steal from you again, I can assure you I won't. I made a mistake, and I'm grateful for your kindness, but I don't need your concern. Pa needs help around here, Caleb piped up, earning another look from his father. With Ma gone, there's too much for just us. A heavy silence fell over the table at the boy's mention of his mother. Willa observed the pain that flashed across Preston's face before he schooled his features. What my son means, Preston said carefully, is that we could use an extra pair of hands. Room and board in exchange for help with cooking, cleaning, and tending the garden. Just until you find your footing in Deadwood. Willa stared at him, searching for ulterior motives. She'd learned the hard way that offers that seemed too good to be true usually were. Why would you help a thief? You're not a thief, Preston said with certainty. You're hungry. There's a difference. You don't know me, Willa challenged. I know enough, he countered. I know you put the cornmeal back when you could have run with it. I know you're sitting up straight despite being half-starved. And I know that folks deserve second chances. Willa looked between father and son, weighing her options. The reality was she had nowhere to go and no prospects. Winter was indeed coming, and she wouldn't survive it without shelter. I can cook, she said finally. And so, I'm a quick learner with everything else. Relief visibly swept over Caleb's young face. Preston simply nodded, as if he'd never doubted her acceptance. There's a small room off the kitchen, he said. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. Thank you, Willa said, the words feeling insufficient for the reprieve she'd been granted. I won't make you regret this. Preston's expression remained unreadable as he stood to clear the plates. Get some rest, Miss Harper. Tomorrow comes early in these parts. That night, lying on a real bed for the first time in days, Willa stared at the ceiling of the small room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin settling. She'd come to Deadwood chasing promises made in letters from a man she'd never met, a mining engineer who claimed to want a wife and had courted her through correspondence for nearly a year. Upon arrival, she discovered he was already married, using multiple correspondences to lure women west for purposes she refused to consider. With no money to return east and her possessions stolen during her first night in town, Willa had found herself stranded in a place where a woman alone had few respectable options. Yet somehow, through a failed attempt at theft, she'd found shelter with a widower and his son. As sleep finally claimed her, Willa wondered how long this unexpected mercy would last before, like everything else since arriving in Deadwood, it revealed itself to be just another disappointment. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee brewing. Willa woke disoriented before remembering where she was. She quickly dressed in her only clothes, smoothed her hair as best she could, and ventured into the kitchen. Preston was already up, pouring coffee into a mug. He nodded at her entrance. There's water heating on the stove if you want to wash, he said. Caleb's out feeding the animals. We've got chickens, 2 milk cows, and horses in the stable. Thank you, Willa replied, accepting the mug he offered. I'll get breakfast started. Preston raised an eyebrow. Already earning your keep? I believe in holding up my end of an arrangement, she said simply. He nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. Supplies are in the pantry, the one you were already familiar with, he added, a hint of amusement in his voice. I'll be mending the north fence. We eat a good breakfast here. Ranching builds an appetite. After he left, Willa explored the kitchen, taking inventory of what was available. She found eggs, bacon, flour, and other basics. By the time Preston and Caleb returned, she had a hearty breakfast waiting: fried eggs, bacon, and biscuits that were perhaps not as light as they could be, but certainly edible. This is better than Pa's cooking, Caleb declared, eagerly digging in. Mind your manners, Preston admonished, though he too ate with appreciation. This is good, Miss Harper. Thank you. Please, call me Willa, she said, uncomfortable with the formality after accepting his charity. Preston nodded. Willa then. And I'm Preston. No need for Mr. Owens under our own roof. Our roof. The casual inclusion struck Willa more deeply than she expected. She busied herself with her own breakfast to hide her emotion. After breakfast, I can show you around the property, Preston offered. It's 60 acres total, though we only work about half of it. Used to be a cattle operation, but I've scaled back since. He trailed off, and Willa understood he was referring to his wife's death. I'd appreciate that, she said. The tour revealed a modest, but well-maintained ranch. A small stable housed 3 horses, 2 working animals, and a gentle mare that Caleb proudly identified as his. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter storage, spread behind the cabin. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, providing water for both household and livestock. It's beautiful, Willa said honestly as they stood looking over the land. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. It was my wife's dream, Preston said quietly. Sarah wanted a place where Caleb could grow up with open skies. We came from Pennsylvania 5 years ago. Willa sensed the pain beneath his words. How long has she been gone? 2 years this winter, he replied. Pneumonia. Doctor couldn't do anything. I'm sorry, Willa offered, knowing the words were inadequate. Preston nodded in acknowledgement. Life goes on. Has to, with Caleb to raise. He cleared his throat. Speaking of which, I should check the eastern pasture. Make yourself at home. There's plenty needs doing, but you take today to settle in. Despite his instructions, Willa couldn't bear to be idle. After Preston rode off and Caleb went to his lessons, the boy explained he studied with books his father provided, attending the town school only 2 days a week due to the distance. She set about cleaning the cabin. It wasn't filthy by any means, but it clearly missed a woman's touch. She swept, dusted, and organized, finding satisfaction in making herself useful. In the process, she came to know more about the family whose home she now shared. A worn Bible sat prominently on a small table, its pages marked with pressed flowers. A bookshelf held volumes ranging from practical guides to farming to Shakespeare and Dickens. A handmade quilt draped over a rocking chair by the fire showed fine stitching Sarah's work, Willa guessed. Most telling were the daguerreotypes displayed on the mantel. Preston and a pretty blonde woman on their wedding day. The same woman holding an infant Caleb, and the 3 of them together, Caleb perhaps 5 years old, all smiling. Willa carefully dusted around these precious memories, understanding that her presence here was temporary, a business arrangement born of Preston's kindness and her desperation. When Preston and Caleb returned in the late afternoon, they found the cabin transformed. Fresh pine branches in a jar on the table filled the air with their scent. The floors gleamed, the windows sparkled, and a savory smell emanated from the pot hanging over the fire. What's this? Preston asked, looking around in surprise. I hope you don't mind, Willa said, suddenly uncertain. I wanted to be useful. Mind? Caleb exclaimed. It's like magic. Even smells better in here. Preston surveyed the room, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to do all this today. I wanted to, Willa replied simply. Consider it a thank you for taking me in. That evening, they ate the stew Willa had prepared, using ingredients she'd found in the pantry and root cellar. The conversation flowed more easily than the night before, with Caleb eagerly telling Willa about his horse and his studies. Pa says I can go to college someday if I keep up with my reading, he explained proudly. I want to be an engineer and build bridges. That's a fine ambition, Willa said, genuinely impressed. Your father's right to encourage education. Preston watched their interaction with something like relief in his eyes. Later, when Caleb had gone to bed and they sat alone by the fire, he spoke quietly. He hasn't talked that much at supper in a long while, he said. It's good to hear. He's a bright boy, Willa observed. You've done well with him. Preston stared into the flames. I've done my best. It's not easy, being both mother and father. No, I imagine not, Willa agreed. A comfortable silence settled between them before she gathered the courage to ask, May I inquire about your work? You mentioned ranching, but I raise horses mainly now, Preston explained. Train them too. Sell some to the miners, some to the army at Fort Meade. Do carpentry work when it's needed in town. We get by. Willa nodded. understanding that getting by was often the most one could hope for on the frontier. Thank you again for allowing me to stay. I promise I'll earn my keep. Preston studied her for a moment. You already have, but there's something you should know. He hesitated, then continued. Folks in town will talk when they hear I've got a woman living here. Deadwood's not known for its propriety, but reputations still matter. Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks. I hadn't considered that. Perhaps I should. I'm not asking you to leave. Preston interrupted. Just warning you that there might be talk. I don't much care what people say about me, but you might. Mr. Owens Preston, Willa corrected herself. I've already been mistaken for a fallen woman simply for arriving in town alone. Whatever they say about me now can hardly be worse. A hint of a smile touched his lips. You're a strong woman, Willa Harper. Necessity makes us strong, she replied simply. The days settled into a rhythm as September gave way to October. Willa found purpose in caring for the household, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes that had clearly been neglected, and tending the last of the garden harvest. She even began teaching Caleb some of the subjects she'd studied in her own schooling, supplementing the boy's education with lessons in geography and history. Preston, for his part, seemed to relax incrementally as the weeks passed. The permanent furrow between his brows eased, and occasionally Willa would catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. He was unfailingly respectful, never entering her room, always knocking before entering a space where she might be working. Their first trip into Deadwood together came about a month after Willa's arrival. Preston needed supplies they couldn't produce on the ranch, and rather than leaving Willa behind, he invited her to accompany him and Caleb. Are you certain? Willa asked, aware of the potential for gossip. You can't hide out here forever, Preston replied pragmatically. Besides, you'll need some things of your own. Can't keep wearing the same dress day in and day out. Willa looked down at her worn garment, embarrassed. She'd been washing it at night and wearing it again each day, having nothing else. I have no money for new clothes. Consider it in advance on your wages, Preston said, his tone making it clear he wouldn't accept argument. The journey into town took nearly 2 hours by wagon. Willa found herself both anxious and excited to return to civilization, even one as rough-edged as Deadwood. The town had grown even in the short time since her arrival, with new buildings springing up along the muddy main street. Miners, cowboys, and all manner of frontier characters filled the thoroughfare. Preston pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. Caleb, you stay with Miss Harper. I need to speak with Mr. Gardner about those horseshoes he ordered for me. As they entered the store, Willa was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. She kept her head high, focusing on selecting the necessities Preston had encouraged her to find: fabric for a new dress, thread, a brush for her hair, and other personal items. The storekeeper's wife, a plump woman with shrewd eyes, served them. Haven't seen you before, she remarked to Willa. You're with the Owens boy? Miss Harper works for us, Caleb announced proudly before Willa could answer. She makes the best biscuits in the territory. The woman's eyebrows rose. Does she now? Well, Preston Owens has needed help since Sarah passed, that's certain. She leaned closer to Willa. Handsome widower like that won't stay single forever, though girls around here have tried. Too devoted to his wife's memory, they say. Willa felt her cheeks warm. Mr. Owens has been kind enough to provide me with employment and lodging. Nothing more. Of course, dear. The woman replied with a knowing smile that suggested she believed otherwise. Preston joined them as they were finishing their purchases, adding flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples to their order. He paid without comment on Willa's selections, though she noticed he added a small paper-wrapped package she hadn't seen. As they loaded the wagon, a booming voice called out, Preston Owens. Thought that was your wagon. Preston turned to greet a tall man with a sheriff's badge. Marshal Bullock. Good to see you. Likewise, the marshal replied, his gaze shifting to Willa. And who might this be? Willa Harper. Preston introduced her. Miss Harper, this is Seth Bullock, Deadwood's marshal. Madam, Bullock tipped his hat politely. New to our community? Miss Harper is helping out at the ranch, Preston explained, his tone neutral. Bullock nodded, though Willa didn't miss the speculative look in his eyes. Good to have an extra pair of hands, I'm sure. Town's growing fast, Preston. Might be time to consider bringing those carpentry skills of yours to Deadwood more regularly. Always need good builders. I'll keep that in mind, Preston replied. How's Mrs. Bullock? Well enough. Expecting our second child come spring. Congratulations, Preston said sincerely. Give her our best. As they prepared to depart, Willa noticed a group of rough-looking men outside the saloon across the street. One of them stared at her with unsettling intensity, and with a jolt of recognition, she realized he was one of the men who had stolen her belongings when she first arrived in Deadwood. She quickly looked away, hoping he wouldn't recognize her, but it was too late. The man nudged his companions and pointed in her direction, saying something that made them laugh. Preston, observant as ever, noticed her discomfort. Problem? He asked quietly. No, Willa lied, not wanting to create trouble. Just ready to head back. Preston followed her gaze to the men, his expression hardening. You know them? When I first arrived, Willa admitted reluctantly, I was robbed. I believe they were responsible. Without a word, Preston helped Caleb onto the wagon seat. Stay here, he instructed them both, then strode purposefully across the street. Pa looks mad, Caleb observed, watching his father approach the group of men. I ain't seen him that mad in a long time. Willa watched with growing alarm as Preston confronted the men. Though she couldn't hear the words exchanged, the body language told her enough. The man who had recognized her stepped forward aggressively, only to find himself face to face with Preston, who, despite not being the largest man present, carried himself with unmistakable authority. Marshal Bullock, still nearby, drifted closer to the confrontation. His presence seemed to deflate the tension somewhat, and after a few more words, Preston turned and walked back to the wagon. What happened? Willa asked as he climbed up beside them. Just a conversation, Preston replied, his voice tight as he took the reins. Those men won't be bothering you again. Willa wanted to press for more information, but sensed it wasn't the time. They rode in silence for several minutes before Preston spoke again. Did they hurt you? He asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. No, Willa assured him. They took my trunk while I was asking directions at the stage office. I didn't even see their faces clearly until today. Preston nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Marshal Bullock knows them. Says they're troublemakers who drift in and out of town. If they know what's good for them, they'll drift out again soon. What did you say to them? Willa couldn't help asking. A ghost of a smile touched Preston's lips. I merely pointed out that the lady they robbed is under my protection now, and that I take such matters personally. Bullock backed me up. Under his protection. The phrase stirred something in Willa's chest, gratitude, certainly, but also a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Thank you, she said quietly. But please don't put yourself at risk on my account. Preston glanced at her then, his blue eyes serious. You're part of our household now, Willa. We look after our own. The simple declaration nearly brought tears to her eyes, and she turned to watch the landscape to hide her emotion. Beside her, Caleb chatted happily about the candy Preston had bought him, oblivious to the undercurrents of the adult conversation. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Preston presented Willa with the small package he'd added to their purchases, a journal with blank pages and a pencil. Noticed you looking at the books, he explained somewhat gruffly when she expressed surprise. Thought you might like to write your own words. The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Willa deeply. I used to keep a journal, she admitted. Before everything changed. Preston nodded in understanding. Sometimes putting words on paper helps make sense of things. You're very kind, Preston Owens, Willa said softly. He looked uncomfortable with the praise. Just practical. A busy mind needs outlet. As October progressed toward November, the first heavy snows fell, blanketing the landscape in white. The world contracted to the warmth of the cabin, the daily chores of winter living, and the increasingly comfortable companionship of their small household. Willa finished sewing herself 2 new dresses from the fabric Preston had purchased, taking pride in her handiwork. She also knitted new scarves for both Preston and Caleb, working on them secretly in the evenings after they had gone to bed. Preston spent more time in his workshop adjacent to the stable, crafting furniture that Willa learned he sold in Deadwood and the surrounding settlements. His skill with wood was impressive, each piece thoughtfully designed and beautifully executed. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Willa sat by the fire darning socks while Preston carved a small wooden horse. Caleb had already gone to bed, tired from a day spent helping his father repair harnesses. You're good with him, Preston said suddenly, looking up from his carving. With Caleb, I mean. He makes it easy, Willa replied honestly. He's a wonderful boy. Preston nodded, his expression softening. Sarah would be proud of him. She always worried about him growing up out here, away from schools and such. You've educated him well, Willa assured him. He's bright and curious. Those are gifts more valuable than any schoolroom. Still, a boy needs. Preston hesitated, then continued. He needs things I can't give him alone. Willa understood the unspoken admission. You've done remarkably well, Preston. Many men would have sent their child to relatives rather than raise him alone on the frontier. Never crossed my mind, he said simply. He's my son. They fell silent again. The only sounds the crackling fire and the soft scrape of Preston's knife against wood. Willa found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed slightly in concentration, the careful movements of his hands. At 35, Preston Owens was in his prime, strong from years of physical labor, his face weathered by sun and wind, but still handsome in a rugged way. Yet beneath his capable exterior, Willa had come to recognize a gentleness that surprised her. He never raised his voice to Caleb, always listened carefully when either of them spoke, and treated Willa with a respect she hadn't expected. May I ask you something? Willa said, setting aside her darning. Preston looked up. Of course. What made you offer me a place here that day? You could have simply reported me to Marshal Bullock. Preston considered the question, setting down his carving. Wasn't just one thing, he said finally. Saw the hunger in your eyes, for one. Not just for food, but for a chance. He paused. And maybe I recognized something of myself in you. How so? Willa asked, genuinely curious. Came west with nothing but hope and Sarah beside me, he explained. First winter nearly broke us. Would have, if not for a neighbor who helped when we were desperate. His eyes met hers. Sometimes all a person needs is one chance to stand on solid ground again. Willa nodded, understanding. Well, I'm grateful. More than I can express. Preston shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. You've more than earned your keep. Place hasn't run this smooth since, he stopped abruptly. Since Sarah, Willa finished softly. It's all right to speak of her, Preston. She's still part of this home. He looked at her with surprise, then something like relief. Most folks avoid mentioning her. Think it'll pain me somehow. Does it? Pain you, I mean. Preston considered this. Not like it did. More like an old wound that aches when the weather changes. Can't forget it's there, but it doesn't stop me from doing what needs doing. Willa nodded in understanding. My father used to say that grief is just love with no place to go. Wise man, your father, Preston observed. What happened to your parents? Influenza, 3 years ago, Willa replied. They died within days of each other. The house had to be sold to pay debts, and I went to live with my mother's sister in St. Louis. And then to Deadwood. Preston prompted gently. Willa hesitated, embarrassed to admit the truth, but something in Preston's steady gaze encouraged honesty. I answered an advertisement. A man seeking a bride, he claimed to be a mining engineer with prospects. We corresponded for nearly a year. Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. But when you arrived, he was already married, Willa confirmed. It was all a ruse to lure women west for unsavory purposes. Anger flashed across Preston's face. Did he harm you? No, Willa assured him quickly. I fled before he could, but he took my remaining money, claiming it was for my lodging. When I confronted him about his deception, he laughed and said no one would believe me over him. He was right. The few people I appealed to assumed I was just another fallen woman making excuses. I believe you, Preston said firmly. What was this scoundrel's name? Does it matter now? Willa asked, reluctant to revisit the humiliation. It matters if he's still preying on women. Preston replied, his jaw set. Willa considered this. James Wilson was the name he used in his letters. I doubt it's his real name. Preston nodded grimly. I'll mention it to Bullock next time I'm in town. Please don't trouble yourself, Willa protested. It's no trouble to see justice done, Preston replied, his tone brooking no argument. He picked up his carving again, adding, and it's no reflection on you, Willa. Many good women have been deceived by silver-tongued men. His words lifted a weight Willa hadn't realized she was carrying, the shame of having been so thoroughly fooled. Thank you for that, she said softly. They lapsed into comfortable silence again, each occupied with their task. But something had shifted between them, a deeper understanding, a foundation of trust being laid stone by stone. As November deepened, Thanksgiving approached. Willa took special care planning their holiday meal, determined to make it memorable for Caleb and to show her appreciation to Preston. She collected dried berries from the pantry to make a pie, saved extra eggs for baking, and prepared cornbread stuffing for the wild turkey Preston had hunted. The day before Thanksgiving, as Willa was preparing bread dough, Preston entered the kitchen with an unexpected announcement. "Marshal Bullock and his wife have invited us to town for Thanksgiving dinner," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Said they're gathering folks who might otherwise be alone for the holiday." Willa looked up in surprise, flour dusting her hands. "That's very kind of them. Will we go?" Preston seemed uncertain. Hadn't decided. "What do you think?" The fact that he valued her opinion touched Willa. "It might be nice for Caleb to celebrate with other families," she suggested. "And I'd be happy to contribute something to the meal." "Weather's supposed to clear," Preston mused. "Could make it to town and back without trouble." He studied her for a moment. "You've already started preparations, though." "Nothing that can't keep," Willa assured him. "The pie filling will wait, and the bread dough can become dinner rolls to bring along." Preston nodded, decision made. "I'll send word with Miller when he passes by later. He's heading to town for supplies." Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, the snow-covered landscape glittering in the sunlight. They set out early, the wagon loaded with Willa's contributions to the meal: fresh bread rolls, preserved peaches, and a pumpkin pie made from their own garden's harvest. Caleb sat between them on the wagon seat, practically bouncing with excitement at the prospect of a day in town. Willa had carefully dressed him in his best clothes, and she herself wore one of her new dresses, a deep blue wool that Preston had commented looked right fine when she first wore it. Deadwood had transformed since their last visit. Holiday greenery decorated some of the storefronts, and the usual rough atmosphere seemed somewhat tempered by the occasion. Marshal Bullock's home, a respectable two-story structure on the outskirts of town, glowed with lamplight and bustled with activity when they arrived. Martha Bullock, the marshal's wife, greeted them warmly. She was a handsome woman with an air of Eastern refinement that seemed at odds with the frontier town. "Preston, so good of you to come," she said, clasping his hand before turning to Willa. "And you must be Miss Harper. Seth mentioned Preston had found help at the ranch. How wonderful to meet you. Thank you for including us in your gathering, Mrs. Bullock," Willa replied, feeling somewhat self-conscious among the clearly prosperous guests. "Nonsense. Thanksgiving is for community," Martha declared, relieving Willa of the pie she carried. "And please, call me Martha. We don't stand on ceremony in Deadwood." The Bullock's home was filled with an eclectic mix of Deadwood society merchants, miners who had struck it lucky, a few respectable families, and even the town's physician and his wife. Willa noticed that while some of the women gave her curious glances, no one was overtly unwelcoming. Throughout the meal, Willa observed Preston with interest. Among these people, he seemed different, still quiet, but respected. Many of the men sought his opinion on matters from horse breeding to the territory's politics. It was clear he was viewed as a man of substance, despite his modest circumstances. After dinner, while the women gathered in the parlor and the men retired to the marshal's study, Martha Bullock engaged Willa in conversation. "Preston tells us you've made quite a difference at the ranch," she said, pouring tea. "I'm so pleased. We've all worried about him and young Caleb since Sarah passed." "They're remarkable," Willa replied honestly. "Both of them. I'm fortunate Mr. Owens offered me the position." Martha's knowing smile reminded Willa of the storekeeper's wife. "Preston has never been one to follow convention," she observed. "But he's a good man, one of the finest in the territory. Sarah was my dear friend, and I know she would approve of someone like you helping to raise her son." "I'm just the housekeeper," Willa clarified, feeling her cheeks warm. Martha patted her hand. "Of course, dear. Though I must say, Preston looks happier than I've seen him in years." Before Willa could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Caleb and the Bullock's young son, who had been playing upstairs. "Miss Willa," Caleb exclaimed, rushing to her side. "Jimmy says there's going to be a Christmas celebration in town with a tree and everything. Can we come? Please?" Aware of the other women watching with interest, Willa gently reminded him. That's for your father to decide, Caleb. But you'll help convince him, won't you? The boy persisted. He listens to you. Martha Bullock's eyebrows rose slightly at this, and Willa felt the speculation of the other women like a physical presence. We'll discuss it with your father later, she promised, desperate to change the subject. The journey home that evening was quiet, all three of them full from the abundant meal and tired from the day's socializing. Caleb fell asleep against Willa's shoulder, and she adjusted her shawl to cover him against the cold. He had a wonderful time, she said softly to Preston. So did I, he admitted. Been too long since we've socialized proper. Caleb needs that. The Bullocks seem like good people, Willa observed. Preston nodded. They are. Seth's bringing civilization to Deadwood, bit by bit. It was Martha's idea to gather folks today. She knows not everyone has family nearby. They rode in companionable silence for a while before Preston spoke again. Notice the women took to you. They were kind, Willa agreed, though she'd been aware of their curiosity. Mrs. Bullock especially. Martha's a fine judge of character, Preston said. Means something that she approves of you. Willa smiled in the darkness. I believe she approves of you having help, more than of me specifically. Preston glanced at her. Don't sell yourself short, Willa. People can see quality when it's before them. The simple compliment warmed her more than her woolen cloak, and Willa found herself grateful for the darkness that hid her pleased expression. December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow that sometimes kept them housebound for days. Willa used these times to teach Caleb indoor skills, how to mend his own clothes, to cipher more complex math problems, and to read aloud with expression. Preston often paused in his own work to listen to these lessons, occasionally adding his own knowledge when the subject warranted it. In the evenings, they sometimes sat together while Preston read from one of his books tales of adventure that captivated Caleb, or poetry that seemed to speak directly to Willa's heart. She discovered that Preston had a pleasant reading voice, deep and steady, bringing the words to life without unnecessary dramatics. One such evening, with a blizzard raging outside, Preston closed the book he'd been reading, Tennyson's poetry, and regarded Willa thoughtfully. Caleb's set on attending that Christmas celebration in town, he said. Been talking of nothing else. It would mean a lot to him, Willa agreed. Means we should find him a gift, Preston continued. Got something I'm making, but wondered if you had thoughts on what else might please him. Willa considered this. He mentioned wanting a book of his own, not a school book, but stories. And perhaps some colored pencils for drawing? He has quite a talent. Preston nodded approvingly. Good ideas. We'll need to make another trip to town soon, weather permitting. He paused. Should find something for you as well. Willa looked up in surprise. For me? That's not necessary, Preston. It's Christmas, he said simply, as if that explained everything. Besides, you've brought something important back to this house. What's that? Willa asked, curious. Preston seemed to search for the right words. Life, I suppose. Before you came, we were just existing, doing what needed doing, day after day. Now there's music again, and laughter. The admission clearly cost him something in pride, but the sincerity in his eyes told Willa how deeply he meant it. You and Caleb have given me far more than I've given you, she replied softly. A home when I had none, purpose when I was lost. There's no gift that could equal that. Something shifted in Preston's expression, a softening, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, but the spell was broken by a particularly loud gust of wind that rattled the windows. Storm's getting worse, he observed, standing to add wood to the fire. Better turn in. Days start early, storm or no. Willa nodded, gathering her mending. As she passed Preston on her way to her room, he reached out and briefly touched her arm, a gesture so unexpected that Willa nearly gasped. Thank you, he said simply, then let his hand fall. In her room, Willa sat on the edge of her bed, her heart beating oddly fast. The brief touch had been entirely proper, yet it felt significant perhaps because Preston was normally so careful to maintain a respectful distance. She opened her journal, a habit she'd developed since Preston gave it to her, and attempted to capture the confusing emotions swirling within her. Was she simply grateful to this man who had saved her from destitution, or was there something more growing in her heart? And if the latter, what could possibly come of it? Preston had loved his wife deeply. That much was clear in everything from how he spoke of her to the way he preserved her memory for Caleb. Willa had no illusions that she could replace Sarah in Preston's heart, nor did she wish to. Yet she couldn't deny that living in this small family, being part of their daily lives, had awakened feelings she'd thought forever destroyed by her bitter experience upon arriving in Deadwood. Foolish thoughts, she murmured to herself, closing the journal without finishing her entry. Whatever Preston's kindness meant, she wouldn't allow herself to misinterpret it or to hope for something that couldn't be. The week before Christmas brought clearer weather, allowing Preston and Willa to make their planned trip to town. This time, Caleb stayed behind with the elderly Mr. Miller, who occasionally helped with heavier ranch work. "Don't want the boys seeing his own gifts," Preston explained as they set out in the wagon. The journey seemed different without Caleb between them, more intimate somehow, despite the layers of winter clothing that kept them while separated on the seat. They spoke of practical matters, supplies needed, preparations for the deepest part of winter still to come, but Willa was acutely aware of Preston beside her in a way she hadn't been before. Deadwood was transformed for the holiday season. Evergreen boughs decorated storefronts, and even the saloons displayed a festive air with red ribbons and candles in windows. The promised community Christmas tree stood in the center of town, already decorated with handmade ornaments. "Town's changing," Preston observed as they made their way to the general store. "Getting civilized, bit by bit. Is that good or bad?" Willa asked, curious about his perspective. Preston considered this. "Both, I reckon. Good to have law and order, schools for children. But something gets lost too, that sense of making your own way, answering to no one but yourself and God." "Is that why you keep to your ranch rather than moving closer to town?" Willa asked. "Partly," Preston admitted. "Land gives a man room to breathe. And Sarah loved that place, seemed wrong to leave it." At the general store, they split up to make their purchases without spoiling each other's surprises. Willa selected a book of adventure stories for Caleb and, after much deliberation, a new pipe for Preston to replace his worn one. It wasn't much, but she hoped he would understand the sentiment behind it. While Preston was occupied at another counter, Mrs. Gardner, the storekeeper's wife, approached Willa with a conspiratorial smile. "Found something for your Mr. Owens?" she asked in a low voice. "He's not my Mr. Owens," Willa corrected automatically. "But yes, I believe he'll appreciate a new pipe." Mrs. Gardner nodded approvingly. "A practical gift he'll like that. Men like Preston value usefulness." She leaned closer. "Though I might suggest adding something personal as well. Perhaps a handkerchief with his initial? I have some fine ones just arrived from back east." Before Willa could refuse, the woman had produced several neatly embroidered handkerchiefs. They were indeed of good quality, and Willa found herself selecting one with a simple P in the corner. "He'll be pleased," Mrs. Gardner assured her as she wrapped the purchases. "A man notices when a woman takes care with his comfort." Willa felt her cheeks warm at the implication, but she didn't correct the woman again. Let her think what she would. Deadwood would talk regardless. Their shopping completed, Preston suggested they take a meal at the hotel before heading home, a rare luxury, he explained, as practical given the cold. The hotel dining room was modest but clean, offering simple fare that nonetheless felt festive compared to their usual meals at home. Seated across from Preston at a small table, Willa was struck by how much more at ease she felt in town now compared to her first desperate days. "You're quiet," Preston observed as they waited for their food. "Something troubling you?" Willa shook her head. "Just reflecting on how much has changed since I arrived in Deadwood. My first day here, I thought this place would be my ruin. Now it almost feels like home." "The ranch is your home," Preston said with surprising firmness. "For as long as you want it to be." The declaration caught Willa off guard. "I assumed the arrangement was temporary until spring, perhaps." Preston studied her across the table, his blue eyes serious. "Do you want to leave come spring?" "No," Willa admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "I don't." Something like relief crossed Preston's features. "Good. Caleb would be devastated. He's grown attached to you." "And I to him," Willa said softly. Their meal arrived then, interrupting the moment. As they ate, their conversation turned to lighter topics: the upcoming Christmas celebration, Caleb's progress with his studies, Preston's plans for expanding his furniture-making business. It was only as they were preparing to leave that Preston brought up a more serious matter. Marshal Bullock found that man you mentioned, Wilson, or whatever his real name is, he said, helping Willa with her coat. Arrested him for fraud and worse. Seems you weren't the only woman he deceived. Willa's hand stilled. Was anyone hurt? One girl wasn't as fortunate as you, Preston said grimly. But she's safe now. Bullock's wife is looking after her. A cold feeling settled in Willa's stomach. I should have reported him immediately. If I had, don't, Preston interrupted, his hand coming to rest briefly on her shoulder. You did what you could to survive. The blame lies with him, not you. Willa nodded, grateful for his understanding, but still troubled. What will happen to him? Territorial prison, if there's justice, Preston replied. Bullock's gathered enough evidence from multiple women to make the charges stick. As they traveled home through the snowy landscape, Willa was quieter than usual, processing the news about Wilson. Part of her felt vindicated that he would face consequences for his actions, but another part grieved for the women who hadn't escaped as she had. You're thinking about it still, Preston observed after several miles of silence. How easily it could have been me, Willa admitted, if I hadn't realized his deception in time. But you did, Preston reminded her. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Willa. Or luckier, she countered. Maybe both, Preston conceded. Then, after a moment, I'm glad it brought you to us, selfish as that might be to say. The simple statement warmed Willa despite the December cold. So am I, she replied softly. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and excitement. Caleb could barely contain himself as they prepared for the community celebration in town. Willa had sewn him a new scarf in green wool, which he proudly wore around his neck. Do you think Santa Claus will come all the way to our ranch? He asked as they rode toward Deadwood, the wagon loaded with food for the communal feast. I expect he knows exactly where good boys live, Willa assured him, exchanging an amused glance with Preston. The celebration took place in the newly built schoolhouse, the largest public space in town besides the saloons. Inside, the Christmas tree glowed with candles carefully placed on its branches, and tables groaned under the weight of food brought by families from miles around. Martha Bullock, clearly in her element as an organizer, greeted them warmly. Preston, Caleb, Miss Harper, how wonderful you could come. Caleb, the children are playing games in the corner while we finish preparing the feast. As Caleb ran off to join the other children, Martha lowered her voice. I'm so glad to see you all here together. It does my heart good to see Preston participating again. After Sarah died, he wouldn't come to any gatherings. Willa helped arrange their contributions on the tables, aware of curious glances from townspeople who hadn't yet met her. Preston stayed nearby, occasionally introducing her to someone he knew, his hand sometimes coming to rest briefly on her elbow in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. The celebration included singing of Christmas carols, readings from the Bible, and finally a feast that brought everyone together at long tables. Willa found herself seated between Preston and Caleb, feeling for all the world like they were truly a family. After the meal, gifts were distributed to the children, simple things donated by the merchants of Deadwood. Caleb received a carved wooden top that set him spinning with excitement, showing it to everyone who would look. As the evening drew to a close, with many families preparing for the journey home through the snow, Marshal Bullock tapped a glass for attention. Before we part ways, he announced, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this celebration. Deadwood may have its rough edges, but tonight proves we're becoming a true community. Applause greeted his words, and he continued, I also have an announcement that I believe will please you all. The territorial governor has approved our petition for a proper courthouse and jail. Construction will begin in spring, and I'm pleased to announce that our own Preston Owens has agreed to serve as master carpenter for the project. Surprised murmurs and more applause filled the room. Willa turned to Preston with wide eyes. You didn't mention this. Wasn't certain it would be approved, he replied, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the attention. It's good work for fair pay. Means I'll be in town more often come spring. Before Willa could respond, they were surrounded by well-wishers congratulating Preston on the appointment. She watched as he accepted their good wishes with quiet dignity, and felt a surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. Later, as they journeyed home through the moonlit snow, Caleb dozed between them, worn out from the excitement. Why didn't you tell me about the courthouse project? Willa asked softly. Preston was silent for a moment, his face partially shadowed by his hat. Wasn't sure how you'd feel about it, he admitted finally. Changes things for us for the ranch. I'll need to be in town several days a week. Means more responsibility falling to you. I can manage, Willow assured him, touched that he had considered her perspective. It's a wonderful opportunity, Preston. You're a skilled craftsman. There's something else, Preston said, his voice low so as not to wake Caleb. Been meaning to discuss it with you. The position comes with a house in town not large, but sound. Marshall thinks it would be better for me to stay there during the work week rather than traveling back and forth every day. Willa's heart sank unexpectedly. I see. So you and Caleb would move to town? Not exactly, Preston replied, glancing at her. Thought perhaps I'd go alone during the week. Caleb could stay at the ranch with you, continue his lessons. I'd return on weekends. You'd trust me with him? Willa asked, genuinely surprised. There's no one I'd trust more, Preston said simply. But only if you're willing. It's asking a lot, I know. The confidence he placed in her was overwhelming. I'd be honored, Willa said softly. Caleb and I will manage just fine. Preston nodded, relief evident in his posture. Good. That's good. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought, before Preston spoke again. This changes nothing about your place with us, Willa. Want to be clear on that. The ranch is still your home for as long as you want it. Thank you, Willa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. At home, they carried the sleeping Caleb to his bed, then worked together to place the gifts they had hidden beneath the small tree Preston had cut and set up in the main room. It was a strangely intimate task, arranging presents in the soft glow of the fire, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked. Should hang his stocking, Preston murmured, retrieving a red woolen sock from his pocket. You've thought of everything, Willow observed with a smile. Preston shrugged. Wanted to be special for him. Sarah always made Christmas magical somehow. You're doing wonderfully, Willa assured him, impulsively touching his arm. Caleb is a fortunate boy to have such a father. Preston looked down at her, something unreadable in his expression. And fortunate to have you, Willa. We both are. In the firelit quiet of the room, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, Willa was suddenly, acutely aware of Preston not just as Caleb's father or her employer, but as a man of good, honorable man who had brought her into his home and his life. The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken things. Then Preston stepped back, clearing his throat. It's late. Should get some rest before Caleb wakes us at dawn. Yes, of course, Willa agreed, flustered by her own thoughts. Good night, Preston. Good night, Willa. In her room, Willa sat on the edge of her bed, her heart beating oddly fast. There had been something in Preston's eyes, just now something beyond kindness or gratitude. Or was she merely seeing what she wanted to see? She took out her journal, writing by the light of a single candle. I fear I am falling in love with him. And I fear even more that he will never see me as anything but a convenient solution to his household needs. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, with sunlight glittering off the snow outside. As predicted, Caleb woke early, his excited shouts rousing both adults. Santa came. He found us. Pa, Miss Willa, come see. They gathered in the main room, Willa hastily pulling a shawl over her nightdress, and Preston appearing with his suspenders still hanging at his sides. Caleb's delight was infectious as he discovered his gifts, the book from Willa, a beautifully carved set of wooden animals from his father, and small candies and an orange in his stocking. This is the best Christmas ever, he declared, hugging first his father and then, to Willa's surprise, throwing his arms around her waist as well. Thank you. You should thank Santa for some of those, Preston reminded him with a smile. I know Santa didn't bring everything, Caleb said with the wisdom of a child on the cusp of understanding adult truths. But that's okay. After breakfast, they exchanged their own gifts. Willa received a beautiful wooden sewing box from Preston, inlaid with different woods to create a pattern of flowers on the lid. You made this, she realized, running her fingers over the smooth surface. Been working on it for weeks, Preston admitted. Noticed your thread was always tangling. It's beautiful, Willa said sincerely. The most thoughtful gift I've ever received. Her gifts to Preston, the pipe and handkerchief, seemed inadequate in comparison, but he accepted them with genuine appreciation. "My old pipe was about done for," he said, examining the new one. "This is fine craftsmanship. And a handkerchief with my initial very elegant. Mrs. Gardner helped me select it," Willa admitted. A hint of amusement touched Preston's lips. "Did she now? I can imagine what she made of that." Willa blushed, recalling the woman's assumptions. "I'm afraid Deadwood has decided I'm more than your housekeeper, regardless of the truth." "Does that trouble you?" Preston asked, watching her carefully. "I've learned not to concern myself overmuch with others' opinions," Willa replied diplomatically. Preston nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. Wise approach in these parts. The day passed peacefully, with a special dinner Willa had prepared and games afterward. As evening fell, Caleb, exhausted from his early rising and the excitement of the day, fell asleep on the rug before the fire. Preston carefully lifted him and carried him to bed, returning to find Willa tidying the remains of their celebration. "Leave that," he said. "Sit with me a while." Surprised by the invitation, Willa joined him by the fire. Preston poured a small measure of whiskey into 2 cups, offering one to her. "Don't usually indulge," he explained, "but Christmas seems to call for it." Willa accepted the cup, sipping cautiously at the unfamiliar liquor. "It's been a wonderful day." "It has," Preston agreed, studying the amber liquid in his cup. "First Christmas since Sarah died that felt right." "I'm glad," Willa said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Eventually, Preston spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Been thinking about the future," he said. "With the courthouse job coming, there'll be more money. Could expand the ranch a bit, maybe build onto the house." "That sounds wonderful for you and Caleb," Willa replied. Preston turned to look at her directly. "I'm not talking just for me and Caleb, Willa." Her heart quickened at his words, but she was afraid to assume his meaning. "I don't understand." Preston set down his cup, seeming to gather his thoughts. "When Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over. Being a husband, having a partner to share things with. Focused on Caleb, on keeping the ranch going. Didn't think beyond that." Willa remained silent, hardly daring to breathe as he continued. "Then you came along first as someone needing help, then as someone giving it. And somewhere along the way—" He paused, searching for words. "Somewhere along the way, I started seeing a future again, one that included you." "Preston," Willa whispered, her voice unsteady. "I'm not asking anything of you now," he clarified quickly. "It's too soon, and you deserve proper courting, not just practical arrangements. But I wanted you to know that when I think of the ranch's future of our future, I see you in it. Not just as our housekeeper." Tears pricked at Willa's eyes, and she blinked them back. "I see that future too," she admitted. "I've tried to remember my place here. But there is no place for you here except the one you choose," Preston said firmly. "You're not a servant, Willa. To me or anyone." The declaration, so at odds with how most men viewed women in their households, touched Willa deeply. "You're a remarkable man, Preston Owens. Just a man trying to do right," he replied with characteristic modesty. "And right now, that means telling you I've come to care for you. More than I expected. More than might be proper, given how recently you came to us." "Propriety seems less important out here than honesty," Willa observed, gathering her courage. "And honestly, Preston, I've come to care for you too. For both you and Caleb, in ways I never anticipated." Relief and something more intense passed over Preston's features. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her hand. When she didn't withdraw, he gently clasped it in his own. "Don't want to rush you," he said, his voice low. "We have time, but I needed you to know where I stand." Willa nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. Instead, she squeezed his hand, hoping he would understand what she couldn't yet say aloud. They sat like that, hands joined, as the fire burned low and Christmas Day drew to a close. Nothing had been formally decided, no declarations of love spoken. Yet Willa felt that something profound had shifted between them, a door opening to possibilities she had thought forever closed when she arrived, desperate and alone, in Deadwood. Winter settled into its deepest phase after Christmas, with January bringing bitter cold and snowstorms that sometimes kept them housebound for days at a time. Yet within the cabin, a new warmth had taken hold. Preston began what could only be called a courtship, though a practical frontier version of one. He carved small gifts for Willa, a delicate hairpin, a set of buttons for her new dress. He made a point of reading to her and Caleb in the evenings, sometimes selecting poetry that made his intentions clear without being overtly romantic. For her part, Willa found ways to show her growing affection special care with his meals, mending his clothes with particular attention, sitting closer to him by the fire in the evenings. They were small gestures, appropriate to their situation, yet laden with meaning both understood. Caleb watched these developments with obvious approval. One morning in late January, as Willa helped him with his arithmetic, he looked up at her with serious eyes. "Are you going to marry Pa?" he asked bluntly. Willa nearly dropped the slate she was holding. "Caleb, that's not a proper question." "Why not?" he persisted. "I see how he looks at you. And you smile more when he's in the room. Your father and I are friends," Willa said carefully. Caleb rolled his eyes in a manner that reminded her startlingly of Preston. "Ma used to say that grown-ups think children don't notice things, but we notice everything." "Your mother was a wise woman," Willow acknowledged. "She would like you," Caleb said confidently. "She told me once that if anything happened to her, I should make sure Pa wasn't alone forever. Because he's better when he has someone to care for besides just me." Tears threatened at the child's earnest words. "Your father is very fortunate to have you looking after him," Willa managed to say. "Now, let's return to these sums, shall we?" That evening, after Caleb was asleep, Willa related the conversation to Preston as they sat by the fire. To her surprise, he chuckled. "That boy never could keep his thoughts to himself," he said, shaking his head. "Sorry if he embarrassed you." "He didn't," Willa assured him, though I was surprised by what he said about his mother. Preston's expression sobered. "Sarah did say something like that, near the end. Made me promise not to bury myself in grief." He stared into the fire. "Took me 2 years to start keeping that promise." Willa reached for his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman." "She was," Preston agreed. "Which is why I know she'd approve of you. Not as a replacement, no one could be that, but as someone who brings life back to this home." He turned to face Willa fully. "And to me." The naked honesty in his expression took Willa's breath away. "Preston, I'm not asking yet," he said quickly. "Still too soon. But Caleb's right about one thing, I do look at you differently. Can't help it." Willa gathered her courage. "I don't want you to help it. And perhaps it's not too soon to acknowledge what's growing between us." Preston's hand tightened around hers. "And what would you call it, Willa Harper?" "Love," she said simply, the word both frightening and freeing as it left her lips. "I'm falling in love with you, Preston Owens. With you and with the life we've begun to build here." The transformation in his face was remarkable, as if years of care had been lifted away. "I've been afraid to say it first," he admitted. "Didn't want you to feel obligated, considering your situation when you came here." "I'm not the desperate woman you caught stealing cornmeal anymore," Willa reminded him. "And what I feel has nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with who you are, the man I've come to know these past months." Preston moved closer to her on the bench they shared, his free hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. "May I?" he asked, his intent clear. Willa nodded, her heart racing as Preston leaned in and gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, almost reverent, and over far too quickly. Yet it held promise of more to come. "I love you," Preston said as he pulled back, the words plain but profound. "Have done for a while now." "And I love you," Willa replied, the declaration easier the second time. They sat together in the firelight, discussing practicalities as well as dreams. Preston spoke of his plans for the courthouse job, of saving to expand the ranch, of the future he now envisioned with Willa beside him. "I want to do this properly," he insisted. "Court you as you deserve, not rush to the altar because it's convenient." "The people of Deadwood may have opinions about that," Willa pointed out with a smile. Preston shrugged. "Let them talk. We know the truth of things between us." As winter slowly yielded to the first hints of spring, their relationship deepened. Preston began taking Willa on proper outings when weather-permitted sleigh rides to view the snowy landscape, a trip to Deadwood for a visiting theatrical troupe's performance, Sunday drives to the small church that had been established on the outskirts of town. In town, they were increasingly treated as a couple rather than employer and employee. Martha Bullock, clearly pleased with the development, invited them to dinner specifically to introduce Willa to other respectable women in the community. "You'll need friends here," she explained to Willa, "especially when Preston begins the courthouse work and is in town more often than at the ranch." The spring thaw brought increased activity. Preston spent more time preparing the ranch for the season's work, while also making regular trips to town to consult on the courthouse plans. Willa took on more responsibility with Caleb's education and began planning a larger garden than the previous year. One particularly fine April day, as Willa was turning soil in the garden plot, Preston returned from town earlier than expected. His expression was troubled as he approached her. "Something wrong?" she asked, setting aside her garden fork. "Marshal Bullock had news," Preston said, removing his hat. "That man Wilson, he escaped custody during transfer to the territorial prison. Been on the run for weeks." Willa felt a chill despite the spring sunshine. "Do they think he's still in the area?" "No one knows," Preston admitted. "But Bullock wanted us aware, given your history with him. Said to be especially cautious if you go to town." Willa nodded, trying to mask her unease. "I'm sure he's long gone from these parts. He'd be a fool to return to Deadwood, where he's known." Preston didn't look convinced. "Maybe, but I'd feel better if you weren't alone at the ranch while I'm working in town. Thought perhaps you and Caleb could stay at the townhouse with me, at least until Wilson's recaptured, and leave the ranch unattended, the animals uncared for." Willa shook her head. "That's impractical, Preston. We can't abandon our home because of a remote threat." Preston frowned, clearly torn between practicality and protective instinct. "Then I'll delay starting the courthouse work." "You will not," Willa said firmly. "This is an important opportunity for you, for all of us. I won't let that man continue to disrupt lives, especially ours." "Willa, no, Preston. I refuse to live in fear," she insisted. "We'll take reasonable precautions. I know how to use a rifle, you've taught me yourself. Caleb and I will be fine at the ranch." Preston studied her, pride and concern warring in his expression. "Stubborn woman," he said finally, but there was admiration in his tone. "You wouldn't love me otherwise," Willa replied with more confidence than she felt. He smiled reluctantly. "True enough." Then, his expression growing serious again. "At least agree to this: if you see or hear anything unusual, anything at all, you'll take Caleb and go straight to the miller's place. And I'll ride out every evening, no matter how late I finish in town." "That seems reasonable," Willa conceded. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Preston brought out a small box and set it before Willa as they sat by the fire. "Been carrying this for a week," he admitted, "waiting for the right moment. But after today's news, I don't want to wait any longer." Willa's heart quickened as she opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but flawless diamond. "Preston, I love you, Willa Harper," he said, taking her hands in his. "Love your strength, your kindness, the way you've brought our home back to life. Will you marry me? Be Caleb's mother and my wife?" Tears filled Willa's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "With all my heart, yes." Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that held none of the restraint of their earlier embraces. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "We'll marry before I start the courthouse job," he said. "No more impropriety for the gossips to fret over." Willa laughed softly, as if they haven't already decided we're scandalously involved. "Let them talk," Preston murmured, kissing her again. "We know the truth." The news of their engagement was met with delight by Caleb and knowing smiles from their friends in town. Martha Bullock immediately offered to host a proper wedding at her home, an offer they gratefully accepted. "Nothing elaborate," Willa insisted. "Just a simple ceremony with those who matter to us." The weeks leading up to the wedding were busy with preparation, both for the ceremony and for Preston's upcoming work in town. Willa sewed her own wedding dress, a practical but pretty blue gown that could be worn again for church and special occasions. Preston worked with renewed energy, completing projects around the ranch that had been neglected. The news of Wilson's escape faded from immediate concern as no sightings were reported in the Deadwood area. Still, Preston made sure Willa was comfortable with the rifle kept loaded in the cabin, and he instructed Caleb in what to do if any strangers approached while he was away. 2 days before the wedding, Preston needed to make a final trip to town to complete paperwork for the courthouse position. Reluctant to leave Willa and Caleb alone overnight, he arranged for Mr. Miller to stay at the ranch while he was gone. "I'll be back tomorrow afternoon at the latest," he promised as he prepared to leave. "Then we'll be married the following day, and you'll never be rid of me." "I should hope not," Willa replied with a smile, standing on tiptoe to kiss him goodbye. She and Caleb watched as Preston rode away, waving until he disappeared from sight. The day passed uneventfully, with Willa and Caleb completing their usual chores while Mr. Miller repaired fencing near the stable. That evening, after a simple supper, Mr. Miller settled in the small guest room while Willa read to Caleb before bed. The boy was unusually quiet, seemingly deep in thought. "What's on your mind?" Willa asked as she tucked him in. "After you marry Pa, will I call you Ma?" he asked seriously. The question touched Willa deeply. "That would be entirely up to you," she said carefully. "I would be honored if you wanted to, but I would also understand if you preferred to keep that name for your mother who loved you first." Caleb considered this. "I think she wouldn't mind sharing. There's different kinds of mothers, and I can have both." Willa blinked back tears. "That's very wise, Caleb, and very kind. So I can try calling you Ma after the wedding?" he persisted. "If that feels right to you," Willa agreed, smoothing his hair. "Now sleep. Your father will be home tomorrow, and then we have a busy day ahead." After Caleb was asleep, Willa sat by the fire, writing in her journal. The house felt different with Preston away, not frightening, but somehow less complete. She smiled at the thought, realizing how thoroughly he had become essential to her happiness. She was so absorbed in her writing that she didn't immediately notice the sound of approaching hoofbeats. When she did, Willa assumed it was Mr. Miller returning from his evening check of the animals. But when no one entered and the sound faded, she felt a flicker of unease. Setting aside her journal, Willa moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit yard. Nothing seemed amiss, yet the silence now felt oppressive. Deciding to check on Mr. Miller, she took the rifle from its place by the door and stepped onto the porch. "Mr. Miller?" she called softly, not wanting to wake Caleb. There was no response. Gathering her courage, Willa descended the porch steps, the rifle ready in her hands. She moved cautiously toward the stable, where a lantern still burned. Inside, she found Miller slumped on the floor, blood seeping from a wound on his head. Heart pounding, Willa knelt beside him, relieved to find him breathing. As she was checking his injury, a voice from the shadows froze her blood. "He'll live. Can't say the same for you, though." Willa whirled, raising the rifle, but she was too slow. A figure lunged from the darkness, knocking the weapon from her hands. She found herself staring into the face of James Wilson, or whatever his real name was, his features distorted with malice. "Thought you'd seen the last of me, didn't you?" he sneered, gripping her arm painfully. "But I don't forget those who cross me. And you cost me dearly, woman. Let go of me," Willa demanded, struggling to free herself. "There are people who know I'm here," the old man. Wilson laughed. "He won't be helping anyone for a while. And your precious rancher is in town, isn't he? Left you all alone out here." Willa's thoughts raced to Caleb, sleeping in the cabin. She couldn't let this man know the boy was there. "What do you want?" she asked, hoping to keep him focused on her. "What I want," Wilson said, his grip tightening, "is to make an example of you. Can't have women thinking they can defy me, report me to the law, and get away with it. The law already knows who and what you are," Willa told him, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Killing me won't change that." Wilson's face darkened. "Maybe not, but it'll satisfy me just fine." He began dragging her toward the stable door. Willa fought with every ounce of her strength, knowing she couldn't let him take her away from the ranch, away from Caleb. In their struggle, Wilson's grip on her arm loosened momentarily. Willa wrenched free and ran, not toward the cabin where Caleb might be endangered, but toward the corral where the horses were kept. Wilson cursed and pursued her. Willa reached the corral fence and vaulted over it with an agility born of desperation. The horses, startled by the sudden intrusion, began moving nervously around the enclosure. "Nowhere to run now," Wilson called, climbing the fence after her. Willa backed away, her mind racing. The horses provided some obstacle between them, but Wilson was clearly determined. As he advanced on her, Willa did the only thing she could think of. She slapped the nearest horse hard on its flank, causing it to rear in alarm. The horse's hooves came down dangerously close to Wilson, forcing him to scramble backward. In the confusion, Willa circled toward the gate, hoping to escape the corral and retrieve the rifle she'd dropped. She almost made it. Her fingers were on the gate latch when Wilson lunged, catching her dress. Willa heard fabric tear as she pulled away, but his momentum carried him into her, knocking them both to the ground. "You'll pay for that," he growled, pinning her down. Willa fought with the fury of someone who had too much to lose. Caleb, Preston, the future they had planned together. She clawed at Wilson's face, kicked at his shins, screamed in hopes that someone might hear. Her struggles seemed to enrage him further. Wilson clasped his hands around her throat, cutting off her cries and her breath. Darkness began to edge Willa's vision as she fought for air. Then suddenly, Wilson's weight was torn away from her. As Willa gasped for breath, she saw Caleb, brave, foolish Caleb, attacking Wilson with a shovel he must have grabbed from beside the stable. "Leave her alone," the boy shouted, swinging the tool with all his strength. Wilson, momentarily stunned by the unexpected assault, recovered quickly. He turned on Caleb with murderous intent. "I'll deal with you next, boy." "No," Willa croaked, her voice raw. She scrambled to her feet, throwing herself between Wilson and Caleb. "Run," she urged the boy. "Get help." But Caleb stood his ground, determination in his young face. "Not without you." Wilson laughed, an ugly sound. Touching, the whore and her brat, dying together. He advanced on them, backing them toward the corral fence. Willa pushed Caleb behind her, desperately searching for something, anything to use as a weapon. The sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the night. "Step away from them," came Preston's voice, cold and deadly. Wilson froze, then slowly turned to face the new threat. Preston stood at the corral gate, rifle aimed squarely at Wilson's chest. His face was a mask of controlled fury. "Should have known she'd have a protector," Wilson sneered, though Willa could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed his chances. "I won't tell you again," Preston said, his voice steady. "Step away from my family." Wilson must have seen something in Preston's expression that convinced him of his seriousness. He raised his hand slowly. "No need for bloodshed. Just having a conversation with an old acquaintance." "Caleb," Preston said without taking his eyes off Wilson, "take Willa to the house." "Now." "But Pa, now, son." Caleb tugged at Willa's hand, but she hesitated. "Preston, be careful. He's dangerous." "So am I," Preston replied grimly. "Go, Willa. Please." Reluctantly, Willa allowed Caleb to lead her from the corral. They hurried to the cabin, where Willa quickly barred the door behind them. Through the window, she could see Preston marching Wilson at gunpoint toward the stable. "Will Pa be all right?" Caleb asked, his earlier bravery now giving way to fear. "Yes," Willa assured him, though her own heart raced with anxiety. "Your father knows how to handle himself. We need to check on Mr. Miller." Keeping Caleb close, Willa retrieved the spare pistol Preston kept in the house. They cautiously made their way to the stable, where they found Mr. Miller regaining consciousness, his head bleeding, but his injuries apparently not life-threatening. "What happened?" the old man groaned, touching his head gingerly. "A very bad man," Caleb explained solemnly. "But Pa's taking care of him now." As they helped Miller to his feet, Preston appeared in the stable doorway. "He's secured," he said tersely, "tied up in the storage shed. I'll take him to Bullock in the morning." "Are you hurt?" Willa asked, rushing to him. Preston shook his head, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "I'm fine. But you," he pulled back to examine the bruises forming on her neck, his expression darkening. "I'll kill him." "No, you won't," Willa said firmly. "He'll face justice properly. We're not like him." Preston closed his eyes briefly, mastering his anger. "You're right. Of course you're right." He turned to Caleb, kneeling to embrace his son. "And you, young man, what were you thinking, facing him alone?" "He was hurting Miss Willa," Caleb said simply, as if that explained everything. "And you always said we protect our own." Something between a laugh and a sob escaped Preston. "That I did. You're braver than men twice your age, Caleb. But don't ever scare me like that again." They returned to the cabin, where Willa tended to Mr. Miller's wound, while Preston checked repeatedly that Wilson remained secured. Neither of them suggested returning to their beds. Instead, they sat together in the main room, Caleb between them on the bench, until dawn broke. "How did you know to come home early?" Willa asked as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows. Wasn't sure myself, Preston admitted. Just had a feeling something wasn't right. Finished my business in town and rode most of the night to get back. He looked down at Caleb, now sleeping against his shoulder. Thank God I did. Thank God indeed, Willa agreed softly. They rode into Deadwood that morning, Preston, Willa, and a bound Wilson on a spare horse. Mr. Miller, despite his protests, had been left at the ranch with Caleb, his injuries not severe enough to require the doctor, but sufficient to keep him from the journey. Marshal Bullock was grimly satisfied to have Wilson back in custody. He won't escape again, he promised, instructing his deputies to place the prisoner under heavy guard. I'll make sure of it personally. Martha Bullock, alerted to their arrival, insisted on examining Willa's injuries herself. That monster, she muttered, gently applying salve to the bruises on Willa's neck. Seth will see him hanged for this, mark my words. Despite the previous night's ordeal, or perhaps because of it, neither Willa nor Preston suggested postponing their wedding. If anything, the experience had reinforced their determination to formalize their bond. I nearly lost you, Preston said that evening as they sat alone in the Bullock's parlor, having been invited to stay in town overnight rather than risk the journey home in their exhausted state. When I saw him with his hands on you. But you didn't lose me, Willa reminded him gently. I'm right here. And tomorrow, I'll be your wife. Preston took her hands in his. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Willa Harper. Not one moment of doubt. Nor I, she assured him. Not one moment. Their wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, as if nature itself approved of their union. The ceremony in the Bullock's home was simple but moving, with Marshal Bullock standing as Preston's best man and Martha as Willa's matron of honor. Caleb, brought to town by Mr. Miller despite his injured head, proudly carried the rings. Willa wore her blue dress, a ribbon covering the worst of the bruises on her neck. Preston was handsome in his best suit, his face solemn yet radiant with joy as they spoke their vows. I, Preston James Owens, take you, Willa Marie Harper, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he said, his voice steady and sure. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Willa repeated the vows, her voice clear despite the emotion tightening her throat. As Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, the same engagement ring now joined by a simple gold band, she felt a sense of rightness, of completion, that transcended the circumstances of their meeting or the dangers they had faced. The small gathering cheered as the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Preston kissed his bride with a tenderness that belied the strength with which he held her. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. Martha had prepared a feast, and the merchants of Deadwood had contributed their finest goods, wines from the saloon owner, pastries from the baker, even flowers grown in the window boxes of the more established homes. To Preston and Willa Owens, Marshal Bullock toasted, raising his glass. May your life together be as strong as your courage and as boundless as your love. As evening approached, Preston, Willa, and Caleb prepared to return to their ranch. The Bullocks had offered their home for the wedding night, but both Preston and Willa were eager to begin their married life in the place that had brought them together. You sure about this? Preston asked as he helped Willa into the wagon. Be dark before we get home. I'm sure, she replied firmly. Our first night as husband and wife should be in our own home. Caleb, sitting between them as always, looked up at Willa with a shy smile. Can I try calling you Ma now? Tears sprang to Willa's eyes as she nodded. I would be honored, Caleb. As they drove away from town, Willa nestled against Preston's side, his arm wrapped securely around her. The future stretched before them, the courthouse project, expanding the ranch, perhaps more children someday. But for now, this moment was enough. The three of them, heading home together as a family. What are you thinking? Preston asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression. Willa smiled up at him. I was thinking about cornmeal. Preston looked puzzled, then understanding dawned. The night we met. Yes, Willa confirmed. How strange life is. If I hadn't been desperate enough to steal, if you hadn't been kind enough to offer mercy instead of judgment, if you hadn't been brave enough to accept, Preston added. Takes courage to accept help sometimes. And now look at us. Willa marveled. Husband and wife. Family, Caleb corrected importantly. Preston laughed, the sound rich and full in the evening air. The boy's right, as usual. Family it is. As the wagon crested the final hill, their ranch came into view, golden in the sunset light. To Willa, it had never looked more beautiful, this place that had become her sanctuary, her home, the foundation of her new life. "Welcome home, Mrs. Owens," Preston said softly. Willa leaned up to kiss his cheek, her heart full to overflowing. "I am home," she whispered. "I truly am." 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the expanded ranch yard as Willa hung laundry on the line, pausing to watch Caleb, now 15, teaching his 3-year-old brother James to ride a pony. Their 1-year-old daughter Sarah sat nearby in a wooden playpen Preston had crafted, solemnly observing her brother's activities. The ranch had prospered in the years since their marriage. Preston's work on the Deadwood courthouse had led to other commissions, establishing him as the territory's premier carpenter alongside his successful horse breeding business. They had added rooms to the original cabin, creating a comfortable home for their growing family. Deadwood itself had changed too, evolving from a rough mining camp to a proper town with schools, churches, and increasing civilization. Marshal Bullock still maintained order, though with a larger force of deputies now. Martha Bullock had established a ladies' aid society, which Willa joined when time permitted. James Wilson had indeed faced justice, convicted of multiple crimes and sentenced to the territorial prison, where he remained. The memory of that night still occasionally haunted Willa's dreams, but the fear had long since faded, replaced by the security of the life she and Preston had built together. As she pinned the last sheet to the line, Willa felt strong arms encircle her waist from behind. She leaned back against Preston's chest, sighing contentedly as he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Thinking deep thoughts, wife?" he murmured against her hair. "Happy ones," she replied, turning in his embrace to face him. At 40, Preston was as handsome as ever, a few strands of silver at his temples only adding to his appeal. "About how fortunate we are." Preston nodded, his gaze moving to their children. "More blessed than I ever dared hope for." He looked back at Willa, his blue eyes warm with love. "And it all started with you trying to steal my cornmeal." Willa laughed, the sound floating across the yard. "I prefer to think it started with you offering me a place at your table." "Forever," Preston reminded her, drawing her closer. "I offered you a place at my table forever." "And I accepted," Willa said softly, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Best decision I ever made." As their lips met, little Sarah called out, "Mama, Papa," from her playpen, demanding their attention. James, spotting his parents embracing, made a disgusted noise that caused Caleb to laugh and ruffle his little brother's hair. "Duty calls," Preston said with mock resignation, though his eyes shone with happiness. "Always does," Willa agreed cheerfully. Hand in hand, they walked toward their children, toward the life they had created together, from an unlikely beginning, a desperate woman, a lonely man, and the simple act of compassion that had changed everything. The table Preston had offered her that first night stood in their dining room still, expanded now to accommodate their larger family. Around it, they gathered each evening, sharing meals, stories, and the boundless love that had grown from the most unexpected of meetings in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, where a struggling father had caught her stealing food and offered her a place at his table forever.